The year was 69 BCE, and the bustling city of Alexandria shimmered beneath the Mediterranean sun. At the edge of the great harbor stood the towering Pharaoh's lighthouse, one of the wonders of the ancient world, its flame guiding merchants, scholars, and emissaries from every corner of the known earth. It was here, in this glittering cosmopolitan jewel, that Cleopatra VII was born. Yet while Alexandria projected power and wealth, the dynasty into which she entered was already crumbling from within, riddled with corruption, greed, and blood. Feuds. Cleopatra's family, the Ptolemies, were descendants of Greek conquerors who had ruled Egypt since the time of Alexander the Great. They spoke Greek, followed Greek customs, and clung to a fragile legitimacy by presenting themselves as pharaohs in the eyes of their Egyptian subjects. By the time of Cleopatra's birth, centuries of intermarriage among close relatives had left the dynasty riddled with rivalries and instability. Brothers fought sisters, mothers poisoned sons, and daughters plotted against fathers. It was the world where survival itself was an achievement, and Cleopatra would prove not only to survive, but to rise higher than any woman of her dynasty before her. From the earliest years of her childhood, Cleopatra stood apart, while most Ptolemaic princesses lived in luxury, cloistered behind palace walls, and prepared for ceremonial roles. Cleopatra showed a restless curiosity. Tutors from Greece and Egypt alike were astonished at her capacity for learning. She mastered languages with ease. By adulthood, she would speak at least 9, including Egyptian, a language most of her ancestors had disdained to learn. The ability to converse directly with priests, soldiers, and commoners would become one of her most powerful political tools. But her education was not limited to words. Cleopatra studied philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. She read the works of Homer and Plato, but she also studied Egyptian theology and ritual. She walked the vast halls of the Library of Alexandria, where papyrus scrolls held the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Surrounded by scholars, mathematicians, and physicians, she absorbed ideas not as curiosities but as weapons, preparing herself for a life where knowledge would mean survival. Her father, Ptolemy XII, was a weak and deeply unpopular ruler, known derisively as Aletes, or the flute player. He was mocked for his obsession with music and his reliance on bribes to maintain his throne. He kept his crown not through strength or leadership, but by paying vast sums of Egypt's wealth. 2 powerful Roman senators. This dependence on Rome was a humiliation for Egypt, and it drained the royal treasury. Cleopatra, still a child, observed how fragile her father's position was, how quickly the tides of politics could shift, and how survival required cunning, not just birthright. When Cleopatra was around 10 years old, her father was driven from the throne by a popular uprising. The streets of Alexandria roared with chants against him, and for a time, Egypt was ruled by his eldest daughter Bernice IV. Cleopatra watched as her half-sister seized power with boldness, appointing herself queen in their father's absence. But Bernice's reign was short-lived. When Ptolemy XII returned to Egypt with Roman support, he retook his throne with brutal efficiency. Bernice was executed, and her allies slaughtered. Cleopatra learned a terrifying but crucial lesson. Power in her family was never secure, and even those born to rule could be cast aside, betrayed, or killed. These early years hardened her teaching. That sentiment had no place in dynastic politics. She learned to read the ambitions of others, to watch for shifting loyalties, and to understand that survival required both charm and ruthlessness. Where others in her family clung to luxury, Cleopatra sharpened her mind into a weapon. As she grew into adolescence, Cleopatra's charisma became impossible to ignore. Ancient writers describe her not as a woman of surpassing beauty, but as someone whose presence was irresistible. Her voice, her wit, her intelligence, and her ability to adapt to any situation made her captivating. She could disarm rivals with conversation, command attention in a crowded room, and win loyalty where others inspired only fear. This combination of intellect and personal magnetism set her apart in a dynasty where most rulers relied only on wealth or military force. By the time Cleopatra reached her late teens, her father's health and grip on power were failing. He knew his throne would not survive long without Roman protection, and so he willed his kingdom jointly to his teenage daughter, Cleopatra, and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. This arrangement was less about harmony and more about survival. For Egyptian custom demanded that royal siblings marry to preserve dynastic legitimacy. Thus, Cleopatra, barely out of girlhood, was thrust into marriage with her younger brother, and into the perilous position of ruler of Egypt. From the very beginning, the partnership was fraught with conflict. Ptolemy XIII was still a boy, controlled by ambitious courtiers and generals who sought to rule through him. Cleopatra, older and far more capable, refused to be sidelined. She took an active role in governance, appearing on coins in her own name, issuing decrees, and engaging directly with priests and administrators. Unlike her predecessors, she traveled the countryside, visiting temples and speaking to the Egyptian people in their own language. She did not present herself merely as a Greek monarch, but as a true pharaoh, a daughter of Isis who embodied both Greek and Egyptian traditions. Her independent actions enraged the advisors of her brother. They whispered in his ear that Cleopatra sought to dominate him, that she was violating tradition by presenting herself as sole ruler. The palace became a nest of intrigue. Alliances shifted daily, servants carried rumors, and guards pledged loyalty one day and betrayal the next. Eventually, Cleopatra's enemies struck decisively, expelling her from Alexandria and forcing her into exile. Her brother and his advisors claimed the throne entirely for themselves. Yet Cleopatra did not collapse into despair. Instead, she gathered what forces she could, rallying support in Egypt's eastern provinces. She reached out to Arab tribes and foreign mercenaries, preparing to retake her throne by force if necessary. For months, she maneuvered carefully, avoiding assassination attempts and strengthening her position. She had been cast out of the palace, but she remained queen in the hearts of many who saw her as Egypt's rightful ruler. It was at this moment of crisis that fate delivered an extraordinary twist. Far to the west, in Rome, civil war was tearing apart the Republic. Julius Caesar, one of Rome's greatest generals, pursued his rival Pompey across the Mediterranean. Their struggle would spill into Egypt, pulling Cleopatra into the heart of world-shaping events. In 48 BCE, Pompey fled to Alexandria after his defeat at the Battle of Pharsalus, seeking refuge with Ptolemy XIII. But instead of offering protection, Ptolemy's advisors had him murdered at the shoreline, hoping to win Caesar's favor by presenting him with Pompey's severed head. Caesar, however, was disgusted by the treachery. He remained in Alexandria, both to settle Egypt's royal dispute and to reassert Roman authority over the kingdom. For Cleopatra, this was the moment she had been waiting for. Returning to Alexandria secretly, she prepared to confront not only her brother but also one of the most powerful men in the world. The stories of how she presented herself to Caesar would become legend. Ancient writers spoke of her being smuggled into the palace, wrapped in a rug or a linen sack, unrolled at Caesar's feet to plead her case. However embellished these tales may be, what matters is that Cleopatra recognized the opportunity. She saw in Caesar not just a Roman general, but a partner who could restore her throne. As the curtain begins to rise on this next act of her life, Cleopatra stands on the threshold of destiny. She is no longer the curious child in the halls of the Library of Alexandria, nor the exiled teenager cast out by her brother's advisors. She is a queen in her own right, prepared to wield her intelligence, her charisma, and her courage to reclaim Egypt. The palace intrigues of her youth have prepared her for the deadly game ahead, where alliances with Rome will decide the fate of kingdoms. The palace of Alexandria stood glittering above the harbor, but within its marble halls tension pulsed like a storm waiting to break. Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, victor at Pharsalus, had come to Egypt not as a guest but as an arbiter, determined to decide the fate of its throne. Ptolemy XIII, barely a boy but inflated with the arrogance of his advisors, believed he could manipulate Rome's most dangerous general. Cleopatra knew better. She understood that Caesar had the power to make or unmake kings, and if she was to reclaim her throne, she would have to reach him directly. The story of her entry into Caesar's presence is legend. Ancient writers tell us she was smuggled into the palace under cover of night, hidden in a rug or a linen sack, and carried through guarded corridors until she could be revealed before Caesar himself. Whether the tale is literal or embellished, its symbolism is perfect. Cleopatra was willing to risk everything to gamble her life on a single bold gesture. When she stood before Caesar, she did not plead like a desperate exile. She spoke as a queen, intelligent, poised, and utterly certain of her claim. Caesar, weary from civil war and disgusted by Ptolemy's treachery in murdering Pompey, found himself captivated. Cleopatra's intelligence and presence struck him more deeply than beauty alone ever could. He saw not only a potential ally, but a woman who understood power in the same ruthless terms that he did. Within days, Cleopatra had gained what she most needed: Caesar's recognition of her as rightful Queen of Egypt. The consequences were immediate. Ptolemy's advisors raged, unwilling to accept a woman's dominance, and they raised an army against Caesar and Cleopatra. Thus began the Alexandrian War, a brutal struggle fought not just for Egypt's throne, but for the balance of power. In the Mediterranean, Caesar, trapped in the city with limited forces, relied heavily on Cleopatra's knowledge of the terrain and her ability to rally support among Egyptians. For months, fighting raged through Alexandria's streets. Fire consumed part of the harbor, and some believed even the great library was damaged in the chaos. Cleopatra did not remain a passive figure. She moved with Caesar, advised him, and strengthened her image as queen among her people. When reinforcements from Rome finally arrived, Ptolemy's forces collapsed. The boy king himself drowned in the Nile as he tried to flee, leaving Cleopatra victorious. She was now sole ruler of Egypt, though officially she shared power with another younger brother. Ptolemy XIV installed 4 appearances. In truth, her throne was secured by Caesar's sword. Soon after the war's end, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Caesarion, Little Caesar, declaring him the child of Julius Caesar himself. Whether Rome's great general truly acknowledged the boy remains debated, but for Cleopatra the symbolism was vital. By presenting her son as both heir of Egypt and offspring of Rome's most powerful man, she bound her dynasty's future to the rising tide of Roman power. Cleopatra and Caesar's relationship was not merely political, ancient accounts suggest. She accompanied him on a grand journey up the Nile, sailing in a lavish barge while they visited temples and monuments. For Cleopatra, this journey was more than romance, it was propaganda. She appeared as Pharaoh in full regalia, presenting herself as the reincarnation of Isis, with Caesar as her consort. The imagery was deliberate, blending Egyptian religious tradition with her alliance to Rome. For the people of Egypt, it confirmed her authority. For Rome, it showed that Cleopatra was no mere client queen, but a sovereign ruler who knew how to command symbols as well as armies. In 46 BCE, Cleopatra traveled to Rome itself. She arrived not as a prisoner, nor as a supplicant, but as a monarch. She lived openly in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, her presence a sensation among the Roman elite. To some, she was a curiosity, the exotic queen of the East. To others, she was a dangerous influence, a foreign woman who dared to entangle herself with their most powerful general. Statues of Cleopatra as Isis appeared in Rome, shocking conservatives who feared her sway over Caesar. Yet for nearly 2 years, she remained at his side, navigating the treacherous politics of the Republic with the same poise she had shown in Alexandria. But fate, once again, turned sharply. On the Ides of March in 44 BCE, Caesar was assassinated. On the floor of the Senate, his blood spilled beneath the daggers of men who believed they were saving the Republic. For Cleopatra, the blow was devastating. Without Caesar's protection, her position in Rome became untenable. She fled with her young son back to Egypt, her dreams of securing power through Caesar dashed in an instant. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra faced a dangerous landscape. Rome plunged into chaos as rival factions fought for control. Mark Antony and Octavian, Caesar's lieutenant and adopted heir, rose as the most powerful men of the new order. Cleopatra understood that Egypt's survival depended on aligning with the victor, but choosing too soon could mean disaster. For a time, she waited, strengthening her rule at home, promoting trade, and restoring Egypt's wealth. Her younger brother and coroller, Ptolemy XIV, conveniently died around this period, and Cleopatra placed Caesarion, still a child, on the throne beside her. Officially, they ruled as mother and son. In reality, Cleopatra held absolute authority. She minted coins with her own image, dressed as a pharaoh in the temples, and positioned herself as both Greek monarch and Egyptian goddess. For the first time in generations, Egypt had a ruler strong enough to govern without being a puppet of her advisors. Yet Rome's shadow loomed ever larger. By 41 BCE, Mark Antony had established himself as one of the most powerful men in the empire, commanding the eastern provinces. Summoning Cleopatra to answer accusations of disloyalty, Antony invited her to meet him in the city of Tarsus. Many rulers might have gone in fear. Cleopatra turned the summons into a triumph. She sailed up the river on a golden barge, its sails of purple, its oars flashing silver. She reclined beneath a canopy dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, surrounded by attendants costumed as nymphs. The spectacle dazzled Antony. He expected a nervous supplicant. He received a living goddess. From that moment their fates intertwined. Cleopatra secured Antony's loyalty not merely through charm but through calculated partnership. She promised him wealth, ships, and supplies for his campaigns. In return, Antony recognized her as Queen of Egypt and beyond, granting her authority over lands once lost to her dynasty. Together they presented themselves as rulers not only of Egypt but of a broader Hellenistic empire. heirs to Alexander as much as to Caesar. For Cleopatra, this alliance was more than romance. It was survival. She bore Antony 3 children, intertwining their bloodlines. In Alexandria, they lived as monarchs in the grand old style, staging ceremonies that portrayed them as Dionysus and Isis, divine rulers destined to govern the world. To their supporters, they represented a new golden age. To Octavian in Rome, they were a threat that had to be destroyed by the late 30s BCE. The rivalry between Antony and Octavian was no longer hidden. Propaganda flowed in both directions. Octavian painted Cleopatra as a seductress who had bewitched Antony, turning him against Rome. He claimed Antony was abandoning his Roman heritage to live as Cleopatra's puppet, squandering his honor on an Eastern queen. Cleopatra countered with displays of wealth and power, reinforcing the image of herself as a sovereign who could stand equal to any Roman dot in 34 BCE. The conflict reached a peak with the donations of Alexandria. In a lavish ceremony, Antony declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings and distributed territories among their children, presenting Caesarion as Caesar's true heir above Octavian. This act was a direct challenge to Rome's political order, and Octavian seized upon it to rally support. He declared war not on Antony, but on Cleopatra herself, framing the conflict as a struggle to save Rome from the domination of a foreign queen. The stage was set for the final chapter of Cleopatra's reign. At Actium in 31 BCE, the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra faced Octavian's fleet in one of history's most decisive naval battles. Cleopatra commanded her ships with determination, but when the tide of battle turned, she made the choice to withdraw, preserving her fleet and her treasure. Antony, seeing her retreat, followed, leaving their forces in chaos. Octavian's victory was absolute. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra prepared for the inevitable. She fortified the city, amassed treasures, and even tested deadly poisons on prisoners to discover the most painless means of death. Yet still she hoped to negotiate, to preserve her throne for herself or her children. When Antony, broken by defeat, fell on his own sword, Cleopatra carried his body to her mausoleum, mourning the man who had been both her partner and her downfall. Octavian soon entered Alexandria in triumph. Cleopatra, unwilling to be paraded as a prisoner in Rome, chose her own end. Ancient writers describe her death as the bite of an asp concealed in a basket of figs, though whether this detail is legend or truth remains unknown. What mattered was the symbolism. The last Pharaoh of Egypt chose to die as a queen, not live as a captive. With her death in 30 BCE, Egypt fell under Roman rule, ending 3,000 years of pharaonic independence. Yet Cleopatra's legacy endured. To her enemies, she was a temptress who corrupted great men. To her people, she was a ruler who dared to embody their traditions and stand against Rome itself. To history, she became a figure larger than life, a woman who wielded intelligence, charisma, and ambition in a world dominated by men, and who refused to be forgotten. And so, as her story closes, we return to the image of Cleopatra on the Nile, a queen who transformed herself into a goddess, who dared to match wits with Caesar and Antony, and who, in her final act, turned defeat into legend. Hers was a life of extraordinary triumph and tragic fall, yet through it all, she remained what she had always been. A woman who understood that power is seized, not given, and that legacy endures long after empires crumble. When Cleopatra's body was laid to rest in her mausoleum at Alexandria, an era ended. With her death, The last independent pharaoh of Egypt was gone, and the kingdom that had stood for millennia fell under Rome's shadow. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, claimed the land as his personal province, ensuring that Egypt would never again challenge Rome's supremacy. Yet, though Cleopatra's physical reign had ended, her story was only beginning. In death, she became more powerful as a symbol than she had ever been as a queen. In the days immediately following her death, Octavian carefully shaped the narrative. He presented himself not as a conqueror of Rome's own general, Antony, but as the savior of Rome from a foreign seductress. Cleopatra became the perfect villain in his propaganda. She was cast as a scheming temptress who lured Antony away from Roman virtue, convincing him to betray his people for Eastern luxury. Octavian paraded this image across the empire, ensuring that when he returned to Rome in triumph, the people celebrated him as the man who had freed them from her grasp. But for the people of Egypt, the memory of Cleopatra was not one of seduction and deceit. In temples across the Nile Valley, she was remembered as Pharaoh, the daughter of Isis who had honored their traditions and spoken their tongue. She had walked among them, overseen their rituals, and taken seriously the role of Egypt's protector. Even after Rome claimed their land, stories of her wisdom and courage lingered. To Egyptians, she was not a villain, but the last great guardian of their independence. In Rome, however, her legend was twisted to serve political ends. Poets and historians commissioned under Augustus painted her as a cautionary tale, the dangerous woman who nearly toppled the Republic. Virgil's Aeneid portrayed her as a dark queen allied with barbarian gods, standing in opposition to Rome's destiny. Horace warned of her mad ambition, while Propertius described her as a witch queen whose charms ensnared the noblest of Romans. Through such words, Augustus ensured that Romans would remember Cleopatra, not as a monarch defending her throne, but as a seductress who threatened the moral fabric of their society. Yet even within these hostile portrayals, her power shone through. For if she had truly been nothing more than a woman of beauty, why would Rome's greatest men have risked their careers and lives for her? The very venom of Augustus's propaganda revealed an uncomfortable truth. Cleopatra had stood as Rome's equal, and Rome could not tolerate the memory of a queen who had dared to challenge its supremacy. Over the centuries, Cleopatra's image shifted again and again, molded by the needs of those who retold her story. In the generations after Augustus, playwrights and chroniclers reimagined her life. To some, she became the tragic lover, a woman undone by passion for Antony. To others, she was a cunning strategist, sacrificing everything to preserve her dynasty. In each retelling, her legend grew, blending fact with imagination until history and myth became inseparable. The medieval world saw her through the lens of morality tales. European writers turned her into an example of vanity, warning that beauty and ambition led only to destruction. Yet in the Islamic world, scholars often portrayed her more favorably, as a philosopher queen who pursued knowledge and alchemy, a patron of wisdom in line with the traditions of Alexandria's great scholars. The Renaissance revived Cleopatra with renewed fascination. Artists painted her death with romantic flair, draping her in jewels as she embraced the serpent of her own choosing. Playwrights like Shakespeare gave her words of fire and poetry, turning her final hours into theatre that captured the imagination of audiences across Europe. In his hands, she became both tragic and majestic, a queen whose grandeur made her fall all the more powerful. By the 19th century, Cleopatra had become a symbol of mystery and allure. exoticized by Orientalist painters and poets, draped in silks, reclining against golden couches. She was portrayed as the ultimate femme fatale, an icon of irresistible seduction. Yet alongside this romantic image, serious historians began to reclaim the complexity of her rule, recognizing her as a capable leader who navigated impossible circumstances with intelligence and daring. Through all these shifting portrayals, one constant remained. Cleopatra refused to be forgotten. Unlike so many rulers of her age, whose names faded into the dust of time, she endured in memory precisely because she embodied contradictions. She was Greek by heritage, yet Egyptian by rule. She was a monarch in a man's world, yet held her own against the most powerful generals of her time. She was portrayed as both goddess and mortal woman, villain and heroine, seductress and scholar. These contradictions ensured that every generation could find in her a mirror for its own fears, fascinations, and ideals. And what of her true legacy? In her lifetime, Cleopatra restored dignity to a dying dynasty. She refused to be a puppet of courtiers, insisting on ruling in her own right. She engaged with her people in ways her ancestors had neglected, earning genuine devotion by respecting their language and traditions. She preserved Egypt's independence far longer than might have been expected in the face of Rome's expansion. Her reign was not one of decline alone, but of cultural fusion and intellectual brilliance, where Greek and Egyptian traditions intertwined in art, ceremony, and governance. Even her defeats tell us much about her strength. Few rulers of small kingdoms could have entangled themselves so deeply with the fate of the greatest empire on earth. Fewer still could have commanded the loyalty of men like Caesar and Antony. And perhaps none other could have transformed her own death into an act of defiance so potent that it echoed for 2,000 years today. Cleopatra remains more than a historical figure. She is a cultural icon. Her story has inspired countless books, plays, operas, and films. She is reimagined again and again, sometimes as a woman of unrivaled beauty, sometimes as a political mastermind, sometimes as both. Each retelling may distort the details, but together they testify to the enduring fascination she commands. What is it about her that lingers? Perhaps it is the way she stood at the crossroads of worlds, Greek and Egyptian, Eastern and Western, ancient and modern. Perhaps it is the way she transformed limitations into strengths, using intelligence where she lacked armies, using charisma where she lacked allies. Or perhaps it is the simple fact that she refused to accept the role the world tried to assign her, where others might have resigned themselves to obscurity. Cleopatra seized the stage of history and left it only when the curtain fell by her own choice. As we look back across the centuries, we see not just the Queen of Egypt, but a symbol of resilience, ambition, and identity. She reminds us that history is not only shaped by armies and empires, but by individuals who dare to act against the tide. She reminds us that legacy is not determined by victory alone, but by the stories told long after. In the end, Cleopatra achieved what so many rulers desired and so few attained: immortality of memory. Her city has crumbled, her dynasty vanished, her kingdom absorbed into foreign rule. But her name endures, whispered in languages across the world, painted in art, spoken on stages, revived in films. The woman who once stood before Caesar and Antony now stands forever in history's imagination. And so her story comes to rest, not in defeat, but in transformation. Cleopatra may have lost her throne, but she gained eternity. She remains the queen who dared to face the might of Rome. the woman who refused to be silenced, the last Pharaoh of Egypt who became, in legend, eternal. With Cleopatra's death, the Nile fell silent. The once mighty kingdom of the pharaohs, cradle of pyramids and temples, now lay in Roman hands. For 3,000 years Egypt had stood as a sovereign land, ruled by kings and queens who claimed descent from gods. But in 30 BCE, that independence ended forever. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, annexed Egypt not as a typical province of Rome, but as his personal possession. The land that had once crowned pharaohs now became the emperor's treasure chest. Egypt was too rich, too vital, too dangerous to be left in the hands of senators or governors who might use it against Rome. Grain from the fertile Nile Valley fed Rome's swelling population. Gold from Nubia enriched the empire's coffers. Whoever controlled Egypt controlled the very stomach of Rome. Octavian understood this perfectly, and so he made Egypt a land apart. No senator could set foot there without his permission. The legions stationed in Alexandria swore loyalty not to the Senate, but to him alone. Through Egypt, Augustus secured not only wealth, but absolute power. The city of Alexandria, Cleopatra's home, was transformed. Its palaces became Roman administrative centers, its harbor filled with Roman warships and merchant vessels carrying wheat to Italy. The scholars of the great library continued their work. But under new masters, their loyalty redirected to Rome. The temples of Egypt, once adorned with images of Cleopatra as goddess, now showed Augustus in pharaonic garb, presenting offerings. To the gods of the Nile, the Romans knew the power of symbols, and Augustus took for himself the mantle of Pharaoh, ensuring the Egyptian people saw him not as a foreign conqueror, but as heir to their ancient kingship. Yet beneath this veneer of continuity, the spirit of independence was gone. Egypt became a land of tribute, its wealth flowing outward, its rulers chosen not from dynastic blood, but from the will of distant emperors. Cleopatra's children fared no better. Caesarion, her son, with Julius Caesar, was executed on orders snuffed out as a threat before he could rally support. Her children by Antony, Alexander, Helios, Cleopatra, Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus were paraded in chains in Augustus's triumph in Rome, living symbols of conquest. Though they were later given guardianship and, in Selene's case, marriage into another royal house, the dynasty of the Ptolemies had ended with their mother's death. For Augustus, Cleopatra's story was invaluable. He fashioned himself as the man who saved Rome from corruption, from the lure of Eastern decadence, from the spell of a queen who had nearly stolen Rome's destiny. In his propaganda, Antony became a fallen Roman, seduced and weakened, while Cleopatra was painted as the embodiment of excess-rich silks, golden feasts, perfumes, and poison. Against this, Augustus stood as simplicity, discipline, and Roman virtue. The contrast gave him the moral authority to reshape Rome into an empire, to end the Republic and claim the title of its first emperor. Thus, Cleopatra's defeat became Rome's foundation myth of renewal. She was not merely an enemy queen. She was the stage upon which Augustus proved his right to rule. By destroying her, he claimed to have purified Rome, and yet, even as he sought to diminish her, the fascination with her never faded. The people of Rome whispered of her jewels, her daring, her death by the asp. Painters carved her image into cameos. Poets immortalized her in verses. Actors reenacted her last moments on stage. Augustus might have tried to define her as a villain, but in the shadows of memory, Cleopatra lingered as something far greater as centuries passed. Her story stretched beyond politics into legend. In the Roman imagination, she became a symbol of Egypt itself, exotic, wealthy, dangerous, alluring. Rome absorbed Egypt physically, but it never fully digested her queen. Even as Roman emperors posed as pharaohs in Egyptian temples, Cleopatra haunted their legacy, a reminder that power could be challenged, that even Rome's greatest men had bent their knees to a woman of the Nile. Meanwhile, Egypt under Roman rule became both a jewel and a frontier. The great temples at Dendera, Philae, and Karm continued to be built, their walls inscribed with hieroglyphs praising emperors in pharaonic guise. The old religion endured, though now in service of Rome's rulers. Alexandria remained a city of learning, its scholars translating Greek and Egyptian texts, its astronomers charting the heavens. But beneath the brilliance lay decline. The people no longer masters of their destiny, their rulers distant and foreign. The Nile still flooded, the grain still grew. But the decisions that shaped Egypt's fate were now made in Rome. Cleopatra's absence was felt most sharply in the silence of Egyptian identity. For centuries, the Ptolemies had been outsiders ruling as pharaohs. Yet Cleopatra had bridged the divide, embracing both her Greek inheritance and Egyptian tradition. With her gone, the bridge collapsed. Rome cared nothing for Egyptian pride. It wanted only stability and harvest. The priests who once found in Cleopatra a patron now bowed before statues of emperors who would never set foot among them. And yet, paradoxically, Cleopatra's legend thrived because of this loss. To Egyptians, she became the last light of sovereignty, the final ruler who had cared for their gods and spoken their tongue. To Romans, she was the dangerous queen whose fall proved Augustus's greatness. To later generations, she became whatever they needed her to be, a warning, an icon, a muse in the centuries that followed. As Christianity spread and ancient temples fell silent, Cleopatra's memory lived on in texts, in plays, in whispered stories. Her face was carved into coins, her story retold in chronicles. She remained vivid where so many kings and queens faded into dust. Her death had not ended her reign, it had transformed it. Egypt belonged to Rome, but Cleopatra belonged to eternity. When Cleopatra left the stage of history, her memory did not vanish with her body. Instead, it began a second life, shaped not by her own hand, but by the pens, brushes, and imaginations of those who came after. Across centuries, across cultures, her story shifted like the Nile itself, bending to the needs and desires of each age. What remained constant was fascination for Cleopatra, refused to be forgotten in the centuries immediately following her death. Her memory was dominated by Rome. Augustus had ensured that his version of events, the noble Roman rescuing the world from a dangerous Eastern queen, became official history. Roman poets and chroniclers echoed this view. In Virgil's Aeneid, Cleopatra appeared as a dark force, standing with barbarian gods against Rome's destiny. To Horace, she was mad with ambition, drunk on her own illusions. To Propertius, she was a witch queen, weaving spells over Antony. Yet even in these hostile portraits, her power shone through. Rome could call her dangerous, but it could not call her irrelevant. She was remembered because she had mattered, because she had come so close to changing Rome's fate. As the Roman Empire gave way to the Byzantine world, Cleopatra's image softened. In the Greek-speaking East, she was sometimes remembered not only as a queen of beauty, but as a woman of learning. The city of Alexandria, long after her death, remained a center of scholarship. And in its memory, Cleopatra became linked to wisdom, alchemy, and medicine. Byzantine writers often spoke of her not as the seductress who lured Antony, but as a ruler who had cultivated knowledge. This strand of memory traveled further east, carried into the Islamic world in Arabic and Persian traditions. Cleopatra became more than queen. She was imagined as a philosopher, a student of alchemy, a seeker of hidden truths. Medieval Islamic scholars sometimes called her Al-Hakima, the wise woman. Stories credited her with building monuments, composing works of science, even discovering secrets of transformation and healing. The Cleopatra of these tales was no longer merely a lover or a queen, but a figure of intellect, a patron of wisdom in line with the legacy of Alexandria's great scholars. It is telling that in the Islamic world she was not reduced to her romances. She was elevated into a symbol of knowledge. Meanwhile, in the medieval West, her story took a different path. European writers, steeped in moral and religious teaching, turned Cleopatra into a cautionary figure. To them, she represented vanity, lust, and the dangers of female ambition. Collections of moral tales listed her among women of ill repute, examples of how beauty could lead men to ruin. Her love for Antony became less a romance than a lesson, that even the strongest men could be undone by desire. In this telling, Cleopatra was stripped of her intellect, her statecraft, her courage. She became instead a mirror for the anxieties of a world where women were expected to be silent and submissive, and yet she could not be contained in that narrow role. When Europe entered the Renaissance, with its hunger for classical stories and rediscovery of ancient texts, Cleopatra returned in new colors. Painters, poets, and playwrights were drawn to her drama, to the image of a queen who lived and died with passion and grandeur. Renaissance art often portrayed her in her final moments, reclining on a golden couch, a jeweled crown slipping from her head, the asp pressed to her breast. She was tragic, but also magnificent. Her death was no longer only a moral warning. It was a spectacle of courage and beauty. No artist gave her a louder voice than William Shakespeare. In his play Antony and Cleopatra, written in the early 1600s, she became more than a symbol. She became human. Shakespeare's Cleopatra was witty, playful, cunning, passionate, tender, furious, vulnerable. She was not reduced to a caricature of seduction, nor exalted as a flawless heroine. She was, instead, alive, a woman who loved deeply, ruled fiercely, and faced death with unbroken pride. Through his poetry, Cleopatra stepped from myth into flesh. She became unforgettable not only as queen, but as woman, a character whose words still echo on stages centuries later. From this moment on, Cleopatra's legend could not be caged. The Enlightenment brought new debates about her. Was she wise or reckless, a patriot or a destroyer, a victim or a manipulator? Historians argued, artists imagined, poets dreamed. Painters of the 18th and 19th centuries filled galleries with visions of her Cleopatra banqueting with Antony amid golden cups and garlands. Cleopatra in her marble chamber, serene as the asp struck. To Europeans in the Age of Empire, she was both exotic fascination and warning, the queen who embodied the mysterious East. The 19th century, with its romantic obsessions, embraced her as the ultimate femme fatale. Writers described her as a woman whose beauty bent the wills of the most powerful men on earth. Painters lingered over her silks, her jewels, her perfumes. imagining her as the embodiment of sensuality. But alongside this romantic image, serious, historians began to reclaim her political strength. Scholars pored over coins, inscriptions, and fragments of texts, discovering Cleopatra not only as lover but as ruler. She was revealed once more as a woman who spoke many languages, who negotiated with kings and generals, who commanded fleets and armies. The veil of myth was pierced by glimpses of reality. And then came the modern era, when Cleopatra stepped onto an even wider stage. In the 20th century, she became the subject of films that brought her to life for millions. The silent films of the early decades cast her as a vamp, a dark-eyed seductress. Later, in 1963, Elizabeth Taylor's portrayal gave her new grandeur. Draped in shimmering costumes, her eyes lined in kohl, commanding both the screen and her roam. That film turned her into one of the most recognizable figures in popular culture, an icon of beauty, luxury, and tragedy. But the story did not end there. As the modern world turned to questions of gender, power, and identity, Cleopatra was reimagined yet again. Feminist writers reclaimed her as a woman who had survived, in a world built for men, who had used intelligence, charisma, and resilience to carve space for herself in history. She was no longer merely the lover of great men. She was their equal, their rival, sometimes even their superior. In classrooms and essays, she became a symbol of female agency, proof that women had shaped the destinies of nations long before. They were given official recognition. Today, Cleopatra belongs to everyone and no one. She is Egyptian and Greek, queen and lover, villain and heroine, scholar and seductress. She is a canvas upon which each age paints its own desires and fears. For some, she is the doomed romantic who died for love. For others, she is the shrewd ruler who stood against an empire. For still others, she is the eternal symbol of female strength, refusing to be erased by the pens of men who hated her. And perhaps that is the heart of her immortality. Cleopatra cannot be reduced to one meaning, one image, one story. She is too vast, too complex, too contradictory. She is the queen who spoke as many tongues as the peoples she ruled. She is the woman who faced Rome's might not with resignation, but with defiance. She is the lover who gave herself fully, and the ruler who calculated with cold precision. She is tragedy and triumph, memory and myth. 2,000 years after her death, she still commands the imagination of the world. Statues may crumble, palaces may sink into the sea, kingdoms may vanish, but Cleopatra endures. She endures because she was more than her time, more than her dynasty, more than her life. She endures because she became a story, and stories, once told, do not die in the whispers of poets, in the brushstrokes of painters, in the voices of actors, in the dreams of scholars. Cleopatra still walks. She walks through the halls of Alexandria, through the palaces of Rome, through the pages of plays and the reels of cinema. She is at once the last pharaoh of Egypt and the eternal queen of memory. And so her journey, begun in the palaces of Alexandria and ended in a marble chamber with an asp, continues still in our words, our visions, our imaginations. Cleopatra lives not in the dust of tombs, but in the beating heart of human fascination. She is legend, she is myth, she is history, she is eternal. More than 2,000 years have passed since Cleopatra drew her last breath, yet her name has never left the lips of the world. Her city fell, her dynasty ended, her kingdom became a Roman province, but Cleopatra herself endures. she endures. Not in stone temples or golden thrones, but in something more powerful: memory. Few in history achieve such immortality, to be remembered not only as a person, but as a story retold and reshaped across centuries. And still, when we whisper her name, we feel a presence, as if she is not gone, but only waiting in the shadows of time. Why has she lasted so long? Why does Cleopatra matter still, when so many other rulers have vanished into dust? Perhaps it is because she embodies questions that never grow old. She was a woman who held power in a world that denied power to women. She was a queen who loved passionately in an age when politics demanded cold calculation. She was a ruler who chose death rather than humiliation. In her, the struggles of history become human, and the human becomes eternal. Let us begin with power. Cleopatra lived in a time when women were expected to be wives, daughters, ornaments, never sovereigns. And yet, she wore the double crown of Egypt, stood as Pharaoh, and commanded loyalty not only from courtiers, but from armies. She spoke to kings and generals as their equal. She bent the course of politics in Rome itself, a city that prided itself on subduing nations but found itself unsettled by a single queen. For this, she was hated by her enemies. Roman writers painted her as a witch, a temptress, a danger to the order of the world. But beneath their fear lies the truth. Cleopatra was powerful, and she proved that power need not come in a man's shape. That defiance echoes still, for every woman who has ever dared to lead knows the shadow Cleopatra casts the price of ambition, but also its glory. Yet power alone does not explain her endurance. There was also love, love so fierce it shook empires. Cleopatra and Antony have become a symbol, not of gentle romance, but of passion that burns like fire. Their bond was filled with risk, with betrayal, with triumph and ruin. They were rulers who gambled kingdoms for the sake of each other, who stood together even when the world turned against them. It is easy to call it folly, to dismiss it as recklessness, but to hearts across centuries, their love feels real because it was lived at the highest stakes. And when they died, he by his own sword, she by her own hand, they became not merely figures of politics, but of tragedy. Their love reminds us that even the mighty are human, that even those who command armies cannot command their hearts. And then there is death. Cleopatra's end is one of the most famous exits in history, precisely because it was hers to choose. Rome longed to drag her through the streets in chains, to display her as a trophy of conquest. But Cleopatra denied them. In that marble chamber, clothed in royal robes, she turned defeat into defiance. Whether it was truly by the bite of an asp, or by poison hidden in a comb, or by some other secret means, the truth remains. She chose her own ending, and in that choice lies her final victory. To the Romans, it was a nuisance. To the world, it was unforgettable. Her death was not surrender, but a declaration. You may take my kingdom, but you will never take my dignity. But Cleopatra's legacy does not rest only in the events of her life. It rests also in the mystery she left behind. Historians debate her motives. Was she ruthless or pragmatic, ambitious or desperate? Was she genuinely in love with Caesar and Antony, or did she see them only as instruments of survival for Egypt? Was she beautiful in the way Roman poets described, or did her true power lie in wit, intelligence, and charm? Every generation asks again, because she never gave us a simple answer. In this mystery lies her immortality. We are drawn to her not because she is easy to understand, but because she cannot be fully grasped. And so, through the centuries, each culture has reimagined her. To the Romans, she was a dangerous foreign queen, the enemy of order. To Byzantine and Islamic scholars, she became a wise woman, a patron of knowledge and alchemy. To the medieval West, she was a warning against vanity. To the Renaissance, she was tragic majesty. To Shakespeare, she was alive, witty, furious, tender, magnificent. To the Romantics, she was sensuality incarnate. To modern times, she is an icon of female power, a reminder of how women have always shaped history. Even when history tried to erase them, Cleopatra is not one story, but many. She is lover and ruler, villain and heroine, scholar and seductress, patriot and dreamer. And perhaps that is why she endures, because she is not confined to one role. She can be reimagined endlessly, each version revealing more about those who tell the tale than about her herself. Today, in our world of shifting empires and contested identities, Cleopatra speaks again. She is claimed by Egypt as the last pharaoh, by Greece as the daughter of Ptolemy, by feminists as a symbol of female strength, by artists as the eternal muse. She lives in films, in novels, in plays, in classrooms. Her coal-lined eyes stare out from paintings and posters, reminding us that beauty and intelligence, power and vulnerability can coexist in a single human being. But perhaps her truest lesson is simpler. She reminds us that history is not only battles and treaties, but people. People who love and grieve, who scheme and dare, who triumph and fall. Cleopatra was a queen, but she was also a mother, a lover, a dreamer, a soul who wanted to shape her own fate. In remembering her, we remember the human in history, and there is something else too, something timeless. Cleopatra shows us that even in defeat, there can be dignity. Even when empires collapse, the memory of a single person can outlast them. Rome conquered Egypt, yet Rome itself has long since fallen. What remains, still vibrant, still whispered across the world, is the name of the queen they feared so much, Cleopatra. So the story ends where it began, not in her palace, not on the battlefield, not in the tombs of Egypt, but in the hearts of those who speak her name. She is more than history, more than myth. She is a mirror in which each age sees its own questions about love, about power, about fate. She is eternal because she belongs not only to her time, but to all time. And when the world grows quiet, when the night deepens, you can almost hear her voice, proud, defiant, amused. Cleopatra does not plead for remembrance. She commands it, and we obey, for we cannot forget her. She was queen, she was legend, she was eternal. Cleopatra is remembered not only for what history tells us, but for what history withholds. Her story, even after centuries of study, is filled with unanswered questions, puzzles that invite us to wonder, fragments that stir the imagination. She is as much shadow as light, as much mystery as fact. And perhaps that is why she has never left us. Let us begin with the greatest mystery of all, her tomb. When Cleopatra and Antony died in Alexandria in 30 BCE, Octavian, soon to become Augustus Caesar, allowed them to be buried together. Ancient writers speak of a splendid mausoleum, a place where the queen and her lover were laid side by side, their deaths transformed into a final union. But where is that tomb? No one knows. The city of Alexandria, shaken by centuries of earthquakes and swallowed by the shifting sea, has hidden its secrets well. Archaeologists have searched in the drowned ruins of the royal quarter, in temples, dedicated to Osiris in desert tombs outside the city. Some believe her burial lies beneath modern neighborhoods, unreachable beneath streets and houses. Others dream that one day a diver's lantern will shine on her resting place, glittering, still with gold and history. Until then, her tomb remains a mystery, a silence that invites us to imagine her last palace, where death itself became theater. Then there is the question of her face. Rome, in its hatred, spread the image of Cleopatra as a temptress of supernatural beauty. Later storytellers pictured her as dazzling beyond compare. Yet coins from her reign show a more complex reality: a strong nose, a firm chin, a determined gaze. Was she beautiful in the conventional sense, or was her true charm in her presence, her intelligence, her voice? Plutarch, writing a century after her death, said her beauty was not remarkable, but her wit, her conversation, her very being made her irresistible. And so we wonder, what did Julius Caesar see when he first unrolled the carpet and found her there? What did Antony see when he met her on that silver ship, sails perfumed, musicians playing? Perhaps the truth is that her power lay not in appearance but in charisma, the rare ability to make every listener feel as though the universe had narrowed to them alone. But because we cannot know, Cleopatra remains whatever our imagination desires her to be. Her voice, too, is a mystery. Ancient accounts claim she spoke many languages, 9, perhaps more. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler to learn the tongue of her people, Egyptian as well as Greek, Aramaic, Latin, and others. Yet we do not know how she sounded. Was her tone soft, commanding, musical? Did her laughter ring like bells in the marble halls of Alexandria, or was it low and sly, the laugh of a strategist? We will never hear it. But in that silence, we create her voice anew each time we tell her story. There are also mysteries of motive. Why did Cleopatra risk so much for Caesar and Antony? Was it love, or politics, or both, entwined so tightly they cannot be separated? Did she dream of ruling a Mediterranean empire with Antony by her side? Or did she know from the start that Rome would never allow it? Was her end the result of miscalculation, or was it inevitable, written by fate? These questions hang in the air like incense, unanswered. They give her story not finality, but openness, a path for each listener to walk in their own way. And what of her children? Cleopatra bore 4, Caesarion, the son of Julius Caesar, and 3 by Antony Alexander, Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. After her death, Caesarion was executed by Octavian, his youth no shield against Rome's fear of rivals. The other children were taken to Rome, paraded in chains during Octavian's triumph. But what became of them? We know Cleopatra, Selene survived, married a North African king, and ruled as Queen of Mauritania. Through her, perhaps, the blood of Cleopatra still runs in hidden lines, echoing in places far from the Nile. As for her brothers, history grows quiet. Did they die young? Were they forgotten in the vast machinery of Rome? The mystery of her children is also the mystery of legacy. What traces survive? What futures were lost? There is mystery, too, in the way her enemies described her. Roman writers could not stop speaking of her, even as they sought to destroy her reputation. To them, she was a sorceress, weaving spells with perfume and wine. Was this slander, or did Cleopatra truly understand the art of theater so well that every meeting with her became a performance? When she sailed to Tarsus to meet Antony, she did not arrive as a supplicant, but as a goddess, sails of purple, oars of silver, music drifting over the water. Antony was summoned, not seduced. This was not witchcraft, but mastery of spectacle, the same mastery that modern leaders still practice. Yet Rome, unable to admit a woman could wield power by intellect and strategy, chose instead to call it magic. And thus, she remains draped in enchantment, part queen, part sorceress, part myth. The final mystery may be the greatest. How much of Cleopatra's story is true, and how much is invention? For nearly everything we know of her comes through Roman eyes, the eyes of her conquerors. They had every reason to paint her as dangerous, reckless, immoral. For in doing so, they justified their conquest of Egypt. Yet even in their hostility, her brilliance shines through. Perhaps the Cleopatra we know is only a shadow cast on Roman walls, but the light that cast it was real. The true Cleopatra, the woman herself, stands just beyond our reach, watching with a smile that time cannot erase. And maybe that is the secret of her immortality. If we knew every fact, if every question had an answer, Cleopatra would be only history. Instead, she is legend because she is incomplete. We are left with gaps, and in those gaps we place our own longings, our own fears, our own dreams. Each age has imagined her anew. The Romans as a temptress, the Arabs as a scholar, the Renaissance as a queen of tragedy, Hollywood as a goddess of beauty, modern voices as a symbol of resistance and ambition. Cleopatra is never finished. She is always becoming. Tonight, when we close our eyes, she drifts again before us, perhaps in her barge with purple sails, perhaps in her chamber robed in gold, perhaps in the silence of a hidden tomb. We cannot know which image is true, and perhaps none of them are. But the mystery is what makes her eternal. The Nile has changed its course, Rome has fallen, centuries have passed. But still we wonder, where does Cleopatra rest? What was the sound of her laughter? What dreams did she whisper to Antony beneath the stars? What secrets did she carry into the grave? Until those mysteries are answered, and perhaps they never will be, Cleopatra lives on, not as a figure fixed in stone, but as a question, a story, a spark of wonder. And in that wonder, she is immortal. Cleopatra's life ended long ago, but her story did not end with her. Like a ripple across water, it spread outward, touching shores far from Egypt. And in those ripples we see reflections, other lives, other legends, other women and men who carried fragments of her fire. For Cleopatra is not only one person, bound to the Nile and the Roman age. She is an echo that resounds through centuries, reminding us again and again of ambition, love, courage, and loss. Let us listen to these echoes in the East 1,000 years after Cleopatra. Another woman ruled with unmatched brilliance, Wu Zetian, the only female emperor of China. Like Cleopatra, she rose in a world built to deny her power. She faced rivals, enemies, whispers of scandal. She was accused of witchcraft, condemned for ambition. Yet she held the throne, commanding poets and generals, reshaping her empire. Her enemies, like Cleopatra's, tried to stain her name, but history remembers her still. When we look at Wu Zetian, we see Cleopatra's echo, the defiance of a woman who would not be silenced on France. Another echo, Joan of Arc. She was no queen, no heir to thrones, but a peasant girl who heard voices and dared to challenge kings. She led armies, inspired soldiers, and changed the course of a war. Like Cleopatra, she stood against an empire larger than herself. Like Cleopatra, she met her end not in victory but in fire and death. And yet Joan's courage, like Cleopatra's, outlived the flames. She became more than human, a symbol, a saint, a legend. Two women, centuries apart, joined by the fact that their deaths could not erase their power. There are echoes in the modern world as well. Think of those who defy empire, who demand to be remembered, who carve their own paths despite the walls. Around them, some are rulers, some are rebels, some are artists, some are dreamers. Cleopatra's story does not belong only to queens, but to anyone who has stood against the weight of history and refused to bow in art to her echo lives. Shakespeare's Cleopatra was not the Cleopatra of history, but she became her own eternal queen, witty, fierce, tragic, beloved. Painters filled canvases with Cleopatra's image, in Renaissance halls, in Victorian salons, in modern films where her eyes are lined in kohl, her voice filled with command. Each time she is reborn, reshaped to speak to a new age. Few figures in history have lived so many lives after death. Few have captured the imagination so completely. Her echo is found in music, in novels, in cinema. Elizabeth Taylor's Cleopatra, for one generation, became the very face of Egypt's last queen, lavish, dramatic, unforgettable. For another generation, she appears as a strategist, a scholar, a cunning politician who fought for her people's survival. And for yet another, she is a symbol of beauty not bound to Europe, a challenge to how the world imagines history. Each retelling is an echo, carrying forward not only Cleopatra's story, but the desires and struggles of the age that tells it. And still the echo moves in movements for women's rights. Her name is invoked as proof that women have always held power, even when history tried to erase them. In debates about empire, her struggle becomes a parable, a smaller nation caught between giants, fighting to keep its sovereignty. In the language of love, she and Antony remain the archetype of passion so strong it defies the world. In the language of tragedy, she remains the queen who chose her own death, leaving behind not shame but dignity. But echoes are not perfect mirrors. Each one changes depending on where it lands. To Rome, Cleopatra was a villain. To Egypt, she is a symbol of pride. To Shakespeare, she was magnificent and flawed. To Hollywood, dazzling and dramatic. To modernize, she may be a scholar, a feminist, a patriot, a survivor. And perhaps that is the greatest echo of all. Cleopatra reminds us that stories are not fixed. They grow, shift, transform, just as the Nile changes course but always flows. And what of us who listen to these echoes now? What does Cleopatra offer to our world? A world far removed from the palaces of Alexandria. Perhaps she reminds us that power has always been fragile, that empires rise and fall, but the human spirit endures. Perhaps she shows us that love, no matter how dangerous, is worth telling, worth remembering. Perhaps she teaches that death, even in defeat, can be a final act of freedom. Or perhaps she offers simply the beauty of mystery, the reminder that not all stories can be closed, not all lives can be explained. For, in the end, Cleopatra is not only Egypt's last queen, she is every voice that dares to rise against silence, every heart that burns with passion, every soul that leaves behind questions instead of answers. She is not one story, but many. Not one life, but countless lives reflected through time. Listen closely, and you will hear her echo in unexpected places, in the speeches of leaders who refuse to bow, in the dreams of artists who paint worlds anew, in the whispers of lovers who defy the world, in the steps of those who walk alone into danger. Unafraid, Cleopatra belongs not only to the past, but to the present and to the future. Her voice is still here, echoing through us, reminding us of what it means to be human, to love, to fight, to fall, to rise again in memory. And so the story continues, not in marble halls or papyrus scrolls, but in us. Each time we speak her name, each time we retell her tale, each time we wonder about her mysteries, the echo grows stronger. Cleopatra is not gone. She is here, always, in the rhythm of history, in the poetry of survival, in the endless song of memory. And when the echo fades, another rises. For legends do not end. They only change their shape. Cleopatra was queen. Cleopatra was legend. Cleopatra is echo. The story has carried us far across deserts and rivers, through palaces and battlefields, from the glitter of Alexandria to the silence of hidden tombs. We have followed Cleopatra's footsteps, her rise, her reign, her loves, her fall, her mysteries, her echoes. And now we come to the end. But how does one end a story like Cleopatra's? She is not just history. She is a flame that refuses to die, a voice that returns each time the wind stirs the reeds of the Nile. To say farewell to her is to acknowledge that her presence lingers, even as we close the page. And so this final part is not an ending, but a gentle release, like the river flowing into the sea, like a song fading into silence, leaving its melody in the heart. Imagine for a moment that we stand on the shores of Egypt at dusk. The pyramids, already ancient in Cleopatra's time, rise against a sky painted with crimson and gold. The Nile glimmers in the fading light, slow and eternal. This river has carried pharaohs and peasants, armies and lovers, dreams and tragedies. It carried Cleopatra, too. It saw her reflection in its waters. It bore the ships that brought Caesar. It echoed the oars of Antony's fleet. Now it carries her memory, flowing onward, endless. The night deepens, and stars awaken. Perhaps Cleopatra once stood as we stand now, watching those same constellations, wondering if the gods were guiding her path or mocking her ambition. She could not have known how long her story would last. She could not have imagined our voices still speaking her name 2,000 years later. But perhaps she hoped. For who does not dream of being remembered? Let us remember her now, not only as queen, but as woman, as dreamer, as soul. She was queen, this we know. She held the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the heir of the last pharaoh of the Nile. She ruled a land of temples and libraries, of gods and scholars. She made alliances, signed decrees, rode in processions, sat in council. She bore the weight of state upon her shoulders, knowing each decision could mean the survival or ruin of her people. To rule in such times was no easy crown. It was thorn and fire. But she wore it still. She was lover. She opened her heart not only for desire, but for strategy, for survival, for ambition. To Caesar, she gave her youth and her brilliance. To Antony, she gave her passion and her courage. Both relationships were more than romance. They were entwined with politics, with visions of empire, with dreams of glory. But they were also human. Cleopatra was not only queen, she was woman. She laughed, she wept, she longed, she feared. In Antony's arms she found not just power, but warmth. And in his death she found a mirror of her own fate. She was mother. 4 children carried her legacy, Caesarion, Alexander, Helios, Cleopatra, Selene, Ptolemy, Philadelphus. Some died too soon, one lived to rule. But in each of them was her hope, her attempt to pass on not only blood, but possibility, a future where Egypt might still endure. A queen may think of empire, but a mother thinks of children. Cleopatra was both. She was strategist. She spoke languages, studied philosophy, debated with scholars, commanded generals. She was not simply a figurehead. She was mind and will. She understood the stage of politics, how to dazzle, how to persuade, how to command. She played Rome's greatest men as much as they played her, and though she lost in the end, it was no easy loss. Rome had to spend armies, years, blood, and breath to bring her down. That alone is testament to her power, and she was legend. For all that we know, for all that we do not, she became larger than life. A queen transformed into myth, a woman transformed into symbol, a name that outlasted kingdoms. But now, at last, it is time to let her rest. The story has been told and retold. The echoes have carried across centuries, yet every story must have its closing moment, its final silence. Picture Cleopatra. In her last hour, she sits in her chamber, dressed not in rags of defeat, but in robes of gold. The air is heavy with incense. The world outside is crumbling. Antony is gone. Octavian is victorious. Egypt is lost. But here, in this room, Cleopatra is still queen. She refuses to be paraded through Rome, chained as trophy. She refuses to let her story end as humiliation. She chooses her own ending, as only a queen can. The asp waits in the basket, a symbol of Egypt itself, deadly, sacred, eternal. Cleopatra reaches for it, calm, resolute. Perhaps her hand trembles, perhaps her heart races, but her will is firm. To die by her own choice is to deny Octavian his triumph. To die as Pharaoh is to leave the world not as captive, but as sovereign. She presses the serpent to her skin. Its fangs deliver not only venom, but release. In that moment, Cleopatra becomes immortal, not because of gods, not because of magic, but because of defiance, because of choice, because she claimed her own ending when all else had been stripped from her. Few rulers in history can say the same. Few souls leave the world with such fire, and so she passes. The chamber grows still. The queen lies silent. The Nile flows on. Centuries later, we stand here, still speaking her name. And now, softly, we say farewell. Farewell to Cleopatra, queen of the Nile. Farewell to Cleopatra, daughter of the Ptolemies. Farewell to Cleopatra, lover of Caesar, partner of Antony. Farewell to Cleopatra, mother, scholar, strategist, dreamer. Farewell to Cleopatra, legend of time, echo of eternity. May the river cradle her spirit. May the stars remember her gaze. May the sands of Egypt keep her secret tomb. And may her story, told and retold, remind us always of the power of ambition, of love, of choice, of mystery. We close the tale, but she is not gone. For each time her name is spoken, she rises again, in thought, in wonder, in imagination. She will rise tomorrow and the day after, as long as memory itself endures. The story ends, but Cleopatra remains.